Hello and welcome everyone. This is third lecture on Hobbes, and in this concluding lecture we are going to discuss his ideas on political obligation, and in the second part we will focus on the critical assessment of Hobbesian political thought. So in the previous two lectures, if you recall, we have discussed his views on human nature, a state of nature, and how he developed a theory of sovereign with absolute power without any scrutiny by the multitude. So this construction of sovereign which exercise absolute power, indivisible power over the multitude is the artificial construct. That is to say, human beings who are free and equal constitute this sovereign through a covenant. So it is not based on divine right theory of king or any given understanding of a state and its sovereign power. So the sovereign power of the state in Hobbesian political thought is based on the covenant or the contract of free and equal members, and therefore this sovereign according to Hobbes is the artificial construct, and that is reflective of his understanding of human nature as not just evil or bad, but also have some creative potentialities or creative enterprise to constitute something through their reflection, through their reason, to create a condition for life which will enable the civic life of the citizens possible. So in that sense, for Hobbesian political theory, human beings are also enterprising being, reflective being, and they use politics to construct an authority which will enable them to pursue their private interest or pursue their private lives without any threat to their life and liberty. So that is the whole purpose of Hobbes' political theory and why we need the absolute sovereign, which we have discussed in the previous lecture. Today we are going to particularly focus on his idea on political obligation. So as you recall that Hobbesian political thought or politics is based on a kind of materialistic understanding. That is to say that for Hobbes, human beings is like matter in motion, and his conception of politics or sovereign or the making of sovereign is based on this very materialistic approach to the question of politics, to the question of desire, aversion, and everything that moves. So in terms of the language that he deploy, the approach that he has is not a kind of a priori theory or a preconceived understanding of human nature or ethical behavior or the purpose of life to lead a happy life. So if you recall his idea of, say, human nature, which is a bundle of desire, and this desire signify the life in the individual. So long human beings are alive, he or she will be guided by their desire, and this desire is ceaseless, that is one after the other. So human life is a constant pursuit of desire and avoiding something which gives pain to their life. Now how to create a condition where this kind of pursuit of human desire or fulfillment of human desire is possible is the purpose, is the center of his construct of this idea of absolutist sovereign. So Hobbes developed his theory of politics, which is based on a materialistic understanding of human nature, and his theory of absolute monarchy or sovereign is based on rigorous scientific and self-evident propositions that starts from the human nature to the state of nature and finally to the making of a sovereign body through a covenant among the free and equal members. So if you look at the artifacts of Hobbesian political theory, there is a kind of logical sequence. At the root of such sequence is how to create a condition where human beings can lead a happy life. and for him happy life is the pursuit of one's desire without any threat to violent death or their liberty. So, in the Hobbesian concept of absolutist sovereign or absolutist monarchy is based on this hypothetical construct of this idea state of nature, where there is a kind of perpetual state of war of each against the all, and there is always the chance of violent death. And to avoid that death, to avoid that fear of death, human beings create a civil authority which has absolute power over them. So, if you look at the logic or the arguments in Hobbes, it is a very convincing or compelling account of why we need a absolutist sovereign and why we should obey the command of sovereign. So, to ensure the long term sustenance of the political regimes, Hobbes developed a compelling and persuasive account of political obligation. And this political obligation, according to Hobbes, is based on individual consent. So, when human beings as a free agent or as an equal member give their consent. So, the obligation of human beings or the people to the sovereign is based on their own consent, which they give individually by coming together in a contract, and through that contract they transfer their rights to the sovereign. This obligation is not based on any conventional or the religious explanation of political regime. So, if you recall in the earlier times or in the medieval times or in the Christian political discourse, the temporal power or the king is seen as the representative of God on earth, and if the whole public life or the collective life of the individual and the community is guided by the religious or the theological discourse, then the obligation comes naturally by the fact that the king or the monarch is the representative of God and we should obey him without any questioning. So, there is a kind of subject relationship with the temporal power or the king. So, individual as the subject should obey the monarch or the king because the king is the representative of God on the earth. And there is also kind of convention. So, because we should obey the king or monarch because it is a convention. As a subject you should obey your king. But Hobbes gives a radically different interpretation of political obligation, where the obligation that individual owe to the sovereign is not based on the convention or any religious understanding of political authority, but it is based on the consent of the individual that they give through a contract among the free and equal member, and that is the basis of a lot of discourse in modern political science about individual rights, why states should protect those individual rights, how these rights are seen as a right to life, liberty, property, and how it further develop into other kinds of rights. So, this understanding is a radical departure in political discourse which we see in Hobbes, where he defines political obligation on the basis of individual consent. It explains in unambiguous terms, and that is another characteristic of Hobbes, where he does not give any subjective account of why we should do certain things in the politics, why we should obey or when we should rebel against the sovereign. His explanation to all these things are nearly mathematical or in unambiguous terms. So, the language that Hobbes use is very different from say Aristotle, Plato or Machiavelli, which we have done. So, it explains in unambiguous term why must we submit to the will of the sovereign, and also why the sovereign is not accountable for its acts to the people. So, the political obligation contains two sides of the theory. One is why individuals should always obey the sovereign, and the other side is why sovereign is not limited by the terms of the contract or not accountable to the people for its act. And explanation that he gives is a kind of unambiguous, without any kind of subjective biases or interpretation of these terms. We are going to discuss these explanation in a moment, but here we need to understand that the logic that he provides for sovereign not being accountable to the terms of contract is the idea that sovereign is the result of the covenant among the free individuals. So, the free and equal members being party to the contract have obligation to obey the sovereign, but sovereign which is constituted or instituted by this contract is not party to the contract, and if he is not party to the contract, then he cannot be forced by the terms of the contract and the covenant. It is a very logical, mathematical or unambiguous explanation of political obligation that we have in Hobbes. So, Hobbes' political obligation, which we are going to discuss in the second part of the lecture, is subject to various kind of interpretation. So, on the one hand, he gives certain inalienable rights to the individual, certainly his right to preserve his life or do everything that prevents any threat to his death or opportunity to exercise his liberty to the maximum. On the other hand, he creates a absolutist monarch which is a constant threat to the individual life and liberty, and that leads to many kind of interpretation of Hobbes. In his lifetime, many regarded him as an atheist because of his religious views, and certainly from the Catholic Church and their authority, Hobbes was regarded as a heretic. So, as an atheist and heretic, Hobbes had enemies in all the camps, and this you can connect with our previous lecture, particularly the first lecture when we discussed the context of Hobbes, where there is a kind of tension between the monarch and the parliamentarians, parliamentary forces claiming to represent the interest of the emerging middle class or the landlords, and monarchs claiming to represent the interest of the people, and in between there is a kind of Catholic church where there is a kind of Protestant ethics or the Catholic ideas on the temporal power and the religious war, and how it leads to some kind of understanding of how to provide legitimacy to the monarchy or to the absolutist regime. Nonetheless, when Hobbes is developing his theory, all these three camps were at constant loggerhead, and there is no settled answer to these different positions about the temporal power, authority, and how to ensure the legitimacy of these authorities. So, what you have as a result is Hobbes considered as an atheist and heretic who had enemies in all camps. So, the royalists, parliamentarians and church, in all these camps Hobbes had enemies. In the 17th and 18th century, the focus was in the last two books of Leviathan, that is of a Christian commonwealth and of the kingdom of darkness. So, much of the interpretation in 17th and 18th century focused on these last two part of Hobbes' Leviathan, that is where he discussed the Catholic church or the Christian commonwealth and the kingdom of darkness, that is how human life or civic life is impossible in the absence of commonwealth or in the absence of civic authority. So, much of the discussion or interpretation of Hobbes in 17th and 18th century is based on these two texts, where Hobbes is seen as irreligious, atheist or a heretic. However, the 19th and 20th century interpretation of Hobbes is based on the first two books, that is of Man and of Commonwealth, where his defense of absolutist monarchy or sovereign is antithetical to our modern democratic sensibility. So, now we have a sense of authority or a state which should be accountable to the people. the power of the state should be separated among the three organs of the state, for instance legislative power, executive power or judiciary power, and these three organs should be separate and independent from each other. So that is the modern democratic sensibilities of a state and its power. However, when we read Hobbes today, it appears that he is defending the absolutist monarchy, which is very antithetical to the democratic sensibilities. But in 17th and 18th century, Hobbes was regarded as an irreligious or atheist heretic scholars who question the religious authority or the authority of the God. So there is a kind of different interpretation of Hobbes, and we are going to discuss in the second part of the lecture today that how different thinkers have interpreted Hobbes in different way. But certainly Hobbes' contribution is in the idea of individual as the basis of a state or a polity, and the existence of a state and polity is to protect the right to life and liberty of the individual, and in protecting that life and liberty he justified the absolutist indivisible sovereignty, and it has its echo in many other theorists of sovereignty as well, where the state is seen as all powerful within the territory of the nation state. So Hobbes has numerous contribution in the field of modern political science, and yet there is a kind of difference in terms of interpretation of Hobbes' political theories, where he was a democrat or a individualist, or he was the supporter of monarchy or the absolutist sovereign. Now we will move on to his idea on political obligation, where it is regarded that Hobbes' greatest contribution to a systematic theory of politics is his unambiguous justification for political obligation. And the theory of political obligation is very different from say Aristotelian or the Platonic idea of politics, or even Machiavellian conception of politics. There you have politics as a domain where individual being live their fullest life or realize their true potentiality. So the guide for political participation is the understanding that human being can lead a truly happy life or realize his true potentialities only in the life of community, in the associational life with others. But here in Hobbes, you have a very scientific and unambiguous explanation of political obligation, why we should obey the state. And here, as I have said in the previous lecture, Hobbesian understanding of human life is a life in private, a kind of passive life, so to say. So it's very different from Aristotelian conception of being, able to rule and being ruled in turn. Here it is okay for the individual to live a civil private life, which is different from the public and political life of the state. And as a private or civic citizen, why we should obey the sovereign? What is the justification for political obligation, and why we should submit to the will of sovereign? And that explanation Hobbes gives is a very radical departure from the earlier understanding of political obligation. So many scholars, however, on Hobbes focused more on his defense of absolutist sovereign or monarchy than his theory of political obligation. But for many other scholars, the contribution of Hobbes to political science is his unambiguous theory of political obligation. So Hobbes' primary concern was on how to secure the obligation of the individuals based not on the idea of divine right of the king, but their own consent. So there is a kind of voluntary action associated in his theory of political obligation. So human beings obey the sovereign not because there is a divine right of the king or there is a convention to obey the monarch, but because human beings voluntarily, as a free individual, submitted to the will of sovereign, and therefore he must obey the sovereign or the will of the sovereign. So for Hobbes, it was necessary for the peace and order to prevail in the society that enables the civic life possible, that the sovereign, and this sovereign can be, as I have said, as an individual, or it can be an assembly of individuals, assembly of men, body or man. So it may be in singular, in plural. Of course, Hobbes chose monarchy as preferable than the assembly of body or assembly of men. So for Hobbes, it was necessary for the peace and order to prevail that the sovereign as an individual body or as an assembly of men should not only be absolute and indivisible, but it was equally necessary that the subjects or the citizens obey the command of sovereign unconditionally and without any scrutiny. So individual, subject or citizen must submit to the will of sovereign unconditionally, that means without any scrutiny. So it is unlike modern democratic state where every action of the government or the state is subjected to public scrutiny. In Hobbesian political theory, he denies some such rights to the citizen. So once they constitute the sovereign, they have no right to question the acts of the sovereign, and they must submit to their will unconditionally and without scrutiny. However, there is a debate among the scholars about what is the basis of this political obligation. So scholars like Nagel and Watkins have argued that Hobbes provides prudent and materialist explanation of political obligation, and this prudent and materialist understanding or explanation of political obligation is based on the fact that human beings will obey the sovereign because of fear. And you know that for Hobbes, fear is the driving force of human action in a sense. So there is a fear of sudden death from violent action or war in the state of nature that drives them in the first place to create an authority which enables the pursuit of private life or pursuit of desire possible. So the fear is the guiding force for the human action in a sense in Hobbesian political theory. And Nagel and Watkins argue that human beings will obey the sovereign not because of any moral and ethical consideration, but because of their fear that if they do not follow the command of the sovereign, there will be the coercive action against them. So one of the reason you have to understand that in the state of nature also there was a sense of natural law or the natural rights of the individual, but those laws and rights are not enforceable in the absence of absolutist authority or absolutist monarch. The existence of authority is precondition for the realization of any natural law or natural rights, and therefore and Nagel and Watkins argue that human beings will obey the sovereign because of fear, as sovereign wields power, coercive power, and it could punish those who disobey or transgress his or their command. That means sovereign in singular or plural exercise certain power and can punish those who transgress its commands or violate the terms of the covenant in a sense. So the reason for human beings to obey the sovereign is based on this fear of sovereign, that if they transgress or violate the terms of the covenant, there is the sovereign authority which will punish them. And second, there is also a fear of going back to the violent state of nature, that is a perpetual state of war of each against the all. And human beings in their rational calculation of which action will protect his life and which action will put their life in danger, will realize that it is better to obey the sovereign than going back to the state of nature, where there will be constant threat to their life and liberty, and they cannot really live peacefully or pursue industry, trade and other skills in life. So the realization of liberty is possible under the command of sovereign. So why they obey the sovereign is because there is a threat that if they do not obey the contract or violate the terms of contract, there is the sovereign authority to punish them. And second, if they do not obey the sovereign, they may go back to the state of nature, and the state of nature is worse than the submission to the will of sovereign. So in that sense, you have a very materialistic or prudent explanation of political obligation according to Nagel and Watkins and Hobbes. In contrast, however, there are other scholars who have argued about the moral and rational basis of such political obligations. So it is not just because of the prudent consideration that human beings obey the sovereign, but also because human beings are also reflective beings. They have the creative energy to constitute something which will enable the larger life or the peaceful life or the pursuit of trade, industries and overall prosperity in the society possible. So in Hobbesian state of nature, as we have discussed, there is also this argument that it is the condition of life in the state of nature that makes human being to behave in a nasty, brutish and short manner. Human beings are not essentially good or bad. They behave in a immoral way or do all kind of things to preserve their life because the condition of a state of nature. But if they live in the situation where there is a civil authority, there is the monarch which controls, or the sword of the monarch or the coercive apparatus of the state is necessary for the implementation of law, for the pursuit of private life or for the pursuit of desires for the individual. So in Hobbes you have also a kind of very positive or alternative understanding of human beings, which is neither essentially good nor essentially bad, as in Machiavelli, where human beings are essentially wicked and only the force can compel them to behave in a certain manner. So in contrast to this prudent or the materialistic explanation, you have other scholars who argued about the moral and rational basis of political obligation in Hobbes. That is, they must obey the sovereign as they have submitted to the will of sovereign in a voluntary manner as a free and equal member through a covenant. So the obligation of individual to the sovereign is not based only on fear, but on their reflective moral consideration that as a free individual or equal member, they themselves have submitted to the will of sovereign through a contract, and this contract has moral obligation on them then to obey the sovereign. So not just because of fear or prudent consideration, but this reflective understanding or rational understanding of humans' moral obligation to the sovereign, because the sovereign is representative of their will, is constituted by the covenant among the free and equal member, and therefore as a party to the contract they have the moral obligation to obey the sovereign. So in this way the sovereign is the representative of the will of the multitude. So once sovereign is constituted through the covenant, then this institutionalized form of sovereign or the artificial construct is representative of the will of multitude, and therefore the power that it exercises over the multitude is authorized by the same multitude. So through the covenant, when they transfer the power, remember the terms of covenant which we discussed in the previous lecture, that every individual transfer their rights to this body of sovereign as a singular or in plural on the condition when other members in the society were also willing to transfer their right to govern themselves to this body. So there is a kind of give and take among the party in the contract. So once the sovereign is constituted, then the power it exercises over the multitudes is authorized by the multitude themselves, and therefore they have a moral obligation to obey the sovereign, which is representative of their will, and exercise the power on their behalf. So the power of the sovereign is therefore then authorized by the people themselves, and this is also very true in modern understanding of republic. So, the authority of the government or the state or the power it exercises is derived from the people. So, so remember any modern constitution, we the people of India or we the people of United States. So, the power and authority is sovereign or the state exercises in modern democracy is legitimized or derived from the people themselves. So, here in Hobbes also you have the similar explanation of the sovereign as a representative of the multitude or the people, and also the power that it exercises is authorized by the same people, and therefore it has a moral obligation on the individual to obey the command of the sovereign. So, Hobbes' theory of political obligation also explain that why sovereign is not accountable to the people. So, we have discussed so far that why individual should obey the sovereign. There is a difference in interpretation whether that political obligation is on the basis of prudent calculation of fear or it is a moral obligation on the part of individual, but nonetheless human beings are supposed to have a moral obligation which they must fulfill, because the sovereign is their representative and the power it exercises over them is authorized by the same people. So, therefore, the human beings should obey the sovereign in all the condition without any scrutiny. Hobbes also provide a systematic answer to the question as to why the sovereign is not accountable to the multitude or why sovereign is not accountable to the people. He answers that obligation applies and binding only to the multitude who are party to the contract, but the sovereign, not being a party to the contract, is not limited in its exercise of power by the terms of contract or covenant. So, the human beings should obey the sovereign because they are party to the contract, but the sovereign is constituted by the covenant. They are not party to the covenant or contract, and therefore, in its exercise of power, sovereign is not limited by the terms of contract or covenant, and therefore, the terms of contract is binding on the people, but the sovereign does not have any such obligation to the terms of contract. So, once the sovereign is constituted, the sovereign knows best how to protect order, how to maintain peace, and in protection of order and peace, the sovereign is free to do anything without any scrutiny by the people. Even sovereign is not limited by the terms of the contract. So, this Hobbes lays out a solid foundation for the absolutist form of government. He provides limitless and unchecked power to the sovereign, and the sovereign is free to do what it deems fit for the maintenance of order and preservation of peace, which will provide the condition for individual to lead their civic life without any threat to their life and liberty. So, the responsibility of the sovereign is to maintain order and peace, and in maintaining order and peace, sovereign is free to do anything without any public scrutiny. So, the sovereign is accountable according to Hobbes not to anyone but to his own conscience or God. So, although Hobbes imagined a minimalist sovereign, it is always the contrary in practice. So, Hobbes thought that the sovereign which is absolute and exercise limitless power will govern little and leave maximum area of life for the individuals to govern themselves. So, the only rule of sovereign is to maintain order and peace, and then everything should be left for the individual to lead their life, to pursue their desire that will lead to prosperity, that will lead to industry, trade, business and overall development of life in a peaceful manner without any threat to their life and liberty. So, Hobbes imagined the sovereign would be minimalist, but this is contrary to the actual practices. All sovereign, all government would try to accumulate more power, unchecked power or unaccountable power. and he leaves little scope for the individual to question the acts of sovereign. It was only in the condition when the sovereign fails to defeat the emergence of alternative rival group or faction that an individual has the right, according to Hobbes, to revolt against the sovereign. So there is no question of disobeying the sovereign, no question of submitting the acts of sovereign to any public scrutiny. It is only possible when sovereign fails the primary responsibility of maintaining order and peace, that is, checking or defeating the rise of any rival groups in the territory. So when a state or sovereign fails to do that, then individual has the right to replace the existing sovereign with the one which can control the rival factions, rival groups, and ensure peace and order in the society. Otherwise, human beings must submit to the will of sovereign unconditionally and without any scrutiny. This, according to Alan Rand, is based on this twin principle. First, for Hobbes, nothing that the sovereign does can be unjust. As sovereign, representative of the will of multitude cannot do wrong. So all the actions that sovereign commit is for the preservation of peace and order, and that is the raison d'etre of the state. So the reason of the state is best known to the state, not to the people or not to the governed. So accordingly, for Hobbes, the sovereign as representative of the multitude cannot do any wrong. So there is no question of scrutinizing or holding the sovereign power accountable. In fact, not obeying the sovereign will be injustice according to Hobbes. Second, people's obligation to sovereign is based on their own free will, hence they must abide by the sovereign without any scrutiny. So that is his theory of political obligation. Now we will move on to critical assessment of Hobbes' political thought. So in Hobbes we have a new science and paradigm of politics which is much more systematic, unambiguous and materialistic, and this you can see as a very different approach to politics than in Plato, Aristotle or Machiavelli. So it is very systematic in a sense that the whole idea of sovereign is based on the understanding of human nature and a state of nature, and why sovereign should have absolute power is explained in a very systematic manner, in a very materialistic manner or in unambiguous term. So influenced by the Euclidean geometry, Hobbes wanted the theory of politics to be based on self-explanatory propositions, and therefore Hobbes claims to be the first political scientist. Prior to them there was a kind of subjective contemplation or speculation about the political life of individual in the state or polis, but Hobbes claims to have a first systematic or scientific understanding of politics, and this is based on his reading of Euclidean geometry, which he considered as the master science, and he therefore played excessive importance on defining something. So let us start with the human nature, which he defines as matter in motion in the pursuit of desire and guided by aversion. That means human being as a matter in motion will constantly pursue desire, and this desire is insatiable, one after the other. So this understanding or definition of human nature is very materialistic, very deterministic in Hobbesian political theory, which is the basis of his understanding of human nature, his understanding of sovereign and life under a civil authority. So it provides a logical and coherent theory of absolutist state, and political obligation also is based on this scientific understanding that we obey the sovereign not because there is a divine right or there is a convention, but because we ourselves voluntarily through contract submitted to the will of sovereign. So the political obligation derives from our submission to the will of God, not on convention or religious understanding. So his theory of absolutist state and political obligation is based on materialistic explanation of human nature. His hypothetical conception of the state of nature becomes the basis for political argumentation for many theorists in social contract tradition on the basis of natural rights, or that leads to understanding of inalienable fundamental rights of the individual that state must protect. So, for many scholars like Leo Strauss and Michael Oxford, particularly his Oxford's book Hobbes on Civil Association, Hobbes was a very systematic theorist of politics who provided a very pragmatic and objective science of politics. So, it is based on prudence and materialistic understanding of human beings and their behaviors based on observation rather than any a priori understanding of their moral, ethical conduct and purpose of life. So, the life for a human being or pursuit of happiness is not guided by any moral, ethical consideration, but a materialistic understanding of human being as a bundle of desire which constantly try to fulfill one desire after the other, and death is the cessation of human desire. When human beings have no desire, then that is death, that is the end of human being as matter in motion for Hobbes. So, his understanding of happiness, pursuit of life is very different from ethical, moral consideration of human life or full realization of human potentiality that we have in Aristotle or Plato. Hobbes treated politics as a creative enterprise on the part of reflective individuals. So, human reason or human beings capability to calculate actions which will help in preservation of life and avoiding those actions which will pose threat to the human life is the basis of the reason, and this reason for Hobbes is not innate. Human beings for Hobbes, if you recall our lecture on human nature, is basically guided by their desire. Reasons is development of human experience while living with others in the society or in assessment of their circumstances of life. So, they guide their action on the basis of their rational calculation of the consequences of their action, whether that action will strengthen their life or pose threat to their life and liberty. So, the calculation that human beings develop or the reasonal faculty that they develop is result of the experience. It is not innate to human being. What is innate to human being for Hobbes is their desire to fulfill those desires which will give them pleasure and avoid those actions which will give them pain. So, that is the natural understanding of human being, but human beings are also capable of creative enterprises such as construction of sovereignty, pursuit of industries, trade, business and so on. So, Hobbes treated politics as a creative enterprise on the part of reflective human beings, and state or the sovereign as the artificial construct is the biggest testimony of the human creativity according to Hobbes. So, and thus for Oxford, Hobbes' Leviathan is the greatest, perhaps the sole masterpiece of political philosophy written in English language. So, his theory of politics and sovereignty has guided the international relation and the foreign policies of the sovereign nation states. In the absence of an arbitrating authority in the international arena, the sovereign states tend to operate like individuals in Hobbesian state of nature. So, Hobbesian political theory for a very long time guided the foreign policy or the international relations among the sovereign nation states, and reason being, in the international arena, unlike in the domestic sphere of a nation state, there is no civic authority, there is no arbitrating authority, and therefore, every nation states or sovereign nation states pursue their foreign policy according to their own national interest, and in that pursuit they are guided by the Hobbesian individual in the state of nature, where there is the absence of political authority or civil authority, an individual is rightful in pursuing anything that preserve their life. Similar is the case with the sovereign nation states in the international arena, where there is the absence of civil authority and all the sovereign states are free to pursue those course of action which will help them in the pursuit of their own national self-interest. Second, there are various plausible criticisms also against Hobbesian political theory. There is a hierarchical sense of civilization in Hobbes' writings, where he regarded the commonwealth or civil authority of free and equal citizens as superior to Christian commonwealth or non-European civilization, which he called dark kingdoms. So, if you remember the 4 parts of Hobbes' Leviathan, 2 part is about Christian commonwealth and also the kingdom of darkness or dark kingdoms. By dark kingdoms, what Hobbes imagined was the Americans in the 17th century in the absence of a commonwealth. So, how a civilization governed itself in the absence of a commonwealth or a civic authority, he regarded as the dark kingdom. So, there is some kind of hierarchy in terms of Hobbesian conception of civilization, and his theory is thus said to become the basis of justification for the colonial rule in African and Asian countries in 19th and 20th century. So, many justification for the colonial regime derives inspiration from this Hobbesian hierarchical understanding of civilization. C.B. Macpherson, in the political theory of possessive individualism, provides a very critical account of Hobbesian conception of human nature, and according to Macpherson, the human beings and the behavior of human beings that we have in Hobbes as self-seeking or ego-gratifying creatures driven by their insatiable desires are based not on universal understanding of human nature or a historical understanding of human nature, but such behavior of human nature is rooted in the bourgeois society or industrial society. So, according to C.B. Macpherson, the conception of human nature that we have in Hobbes is not a universal understanding of human nature. It is very specific to the individual behaviors in a bourgeois society or in an industrial society where their action is guided by their self-interest, or that self-interest is for the gratification of their ego. So, the human being as self-seeking creature guided by their insatiable desire is the characteristic of bourgeois society or industrial society and not the universal understanding of human nature. However, this criticism of C.B. Macpherson is somewhat anachronistic and partly true. The reason being the rise of bourgeois society and industrial society was much later in 17th, 18th and 19th century than when Hobbes was writing. Secondly, Bertrand Russell in the History of Western Philosophy criticized Hobbes for not taking class differences into account while describing human beings as matter in motion driven by their insatiable desire. So, unlike Plato or Machiavelli or even Aristotle, you do not have any class differentiation. So, in Hobbesian understanding of human nature as a bundle of desire is equally applicable to a king or aristocrat or to the subject. There is no difference of classes, which is developed much more fully in Marxist conception. So, Bertrand Russell criticized Hobbes for not considering these class differences that exist in the society. In this sense, Hobbes is blind to the class differences that exist in the society, and he does not differentiate between the king or the aristocrats and the subjects and their conflicting interest. And if you recall Machiavelli's discourses, where he wants to maintain the order in the republic by giving some kind of permanent existence of these conflicting interests, and the managing these conflicting interests requires the role of politics. The politics is about managing those class differences, and that management of class differences will ensure the longevity of republics. Here in Hobbes, there is a kind of absence of such class differences. So Hobbesian human nature is like universal, without any differentiation of classes. So the plebeians or patricians or noble or the subject, they are all constituted of same desire, and their life is pursuit of those desires. So there is no such class differences in Hobbesian writings. And Russell also argued that the peace and order in the historical sense in any society is established not through absolutist power or sovereign, as Hobbes argued, but by making consensus to the different classes and their respective interests. So even the English history, if we look at, there is a kind of concession of power from monarchy to the parliament, from the church to the monarchy, and so on. So the actual history of any society evolved by making concession to different interests, and the rise of democracy in different parts of the country world is the result of such concession to the different sections of the society. So the human beings are not same, their interests are not same, it depends on their class position, socio-economic position, and the peace and order is restored or maintained by making concession to different interests rather than on creation of absolutist monarchy or absolutist sovereign as Hobbes prescribed, and that is the criticism of Bertrand Russell against the Hobbes political theory. Carol Padman in The Sexual Construct presents a feminist reading of Hobbes' theory of social contract, and she argues that in the state of nature, Hobbes had a conception of men and women as equal partner, and there is equality between men and women, and in fact women played more significant role in nurturing the child in the state of nature. However, the covenant which constitute the sovereign is exclusively among the free and equal males, from which women are excluded. So in the covenant that constitute the sovereign, Hobbes do not give any role to the women. And what Padman argue, in Hobbesian conception of public and private life, and he makes a very sharp distinction between these two, where the individual should be free or to pursue whatever he or she thinks is good for them in their private life, and Hobbesian individual happiness depends on their pursuit of desire in the private life or in the civic life. The public life is the life of a state or the sovereign. So in this distinction of public and private in Hobbesian conception of politics, women are further confined to private lives, and even in the household the male head of the family enjoy the absolute power like sovereign in the state. So there is a kind of feminist criticism against the Hobbesian conception of politics, where women are subjugated to the male, and according to Carol Padman, this subjugation is based on what she characterized as the original or the sexual contract, which is prior to the social contract, that subordinate the women and their role in private and public life to that of man. So that is the feminist criticism of Hobbes. Now if we conclude Hobbes' contribution to political philosophy, we have to acknowledge his contribution in terms of providing a scientific and materialistic theory of politics, which is based on objective understanding of human nature, and this understanding of human nature is the basic unit of his whole understanding of state, sovereignty, politics, and so on. Hobbes is generally regarded as an atheist, but he did not disregard religion in totality. So if you read Leviathan, one of the part is on the Christian commonwealth, and also he considered the life as such is the result of God creation. So you have some difference in terms of whether Hobbes was an atheist or irreligious, or there is a reflection on God or soul or life after that, but those things are immaterial which could not be proved scientifically, and Hobbes do not really go in details about those questions of God, religion, and its permanence and so on. But there is the sufficient reason to believe that Hobbes had acknowledged the role of religion, God, when he talks about, say, sovereign being accountable to their own conscience or to the God. So there is the invocation of religious terms also in Hobbes, but largely his theory is objective, materialistic or scientific. So his theory of a state as an artificial corporate legal entity is rooted in his belief in the human reasons and their creative enterprise in instituting the sovereign. So the sovereign is institutionalized by the people, it is not given or divine ordained. So which would make the civic lives of individual possible, and that is why he provides the absolutist theory of sovereign. Skinner in Hobbes and Republican Liberty argues that Hobbes presents a negative conception of liberty as freedom from physical impediments. So the negative conception of liberty starts from Hobbesian thinking, where human beings as a matter in motion, his liberty is denied when there is external impediment which prevents this free movement of matter in motion, and this is the basis of negative and positive liberty in other theorists, particularly in Isaiah Berlin. So the Hobbesian conception of liberty has a negative connotation, that is any external impediments that obstruct the movement or the free movement of human being as a matter in motion is a threat to their liberty, and human being can actually realize that liberty under the rule of a sovereign, absolute sovereign. In the state of nature, there is a realization of that liberty, but it is not realizable in the absence of civic authority, because there is a threat to life and liberty. So there is no possibility of realizing the liberty in the state of nature. Human being can realize it under a sovereign, and the justification of sovereign rule is to provide the maximum condition of liberty to the individual, so that trade flourishes, business flourishes, and there is overall prosperity in the life or in the life of nation. So Hobbes' definition of human liberty, life as a bundle of desire and aversion, and division of life into public and private spheres become the basis of modern discourse on politics. So much of the modern understanding of politics is based on this understanding of human being, division of life between public and private, and so on. His outlining of natural laws and inalienable rights of individual for self-preservation is the basis of formation of modern state. So the responsibility of the state is to protect life and liberty of the individual, and then provide them the condition of relative peace and order where they can pursue their civic life, where they can pursue their desire or what they think is good for them. So however, his absolutist defense of sovereign power presents a threat to individual life and liberty. Similarly, his idea of a minimalist or sovereign is imprudent, and Hobbes' conception of absolutist sovereign with unrestrained power is against the very democratic idea of accountable government and separation of power among the different organs of the state, and that is the valid criticism against Hobbes' defense of absolutist or monarchy or sovereign power. However, in Hobbes what you have is a kind of combination of monarchy or absolutist sovereign with the democratic ideal. So Hobbes seems to have combined the virtues of monarchy with that of democracy. In his conception, the existence and the legitimacy of sovereign or the monarch are based on the contract among the multitude of free and equal individuals. So when we look at the legitimacy of the sovereign, its creation and the authority of its power is all based on free and equal individual coming together and institutionalizing this sovereign through a contract, through covenant, and that is a kind of combination of how the justification for the sovereign and its power is not on divine right or convention, but on the human beings and their voluntary action of coming together and transferring their rights to this body of sovereign. So here in Hobbes you have a kind of combination of monarchy or the absolutist sovereign with that of democracy. So, multitude or the people legitimize the rule of sovereign and their action. Nonetheless, this sovereign is in Hobbesian conception absolute and not subjected to public scrutiny or accountability that we have today in modern democracies. And there is then the valid criticism against Hobbes. However, once the sovereign is constituted according to Hobbes, it exercises absolute, indivisible and limitless power over the multitude, and this leads to serious criticism of Hobbes by later social contract theorists and many democratic theorists such as Locke and Rousseau, which we will do in the subsequent lectures in this course. So, that is all in Hobbes' political theory. On the topics that we have covered today, that is political obligation and the critical assessment of Hobbes' political thought, you should refer to these books, David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to the Present, Gary Browning, A History of Modern Political Thought, The Question of Interpretation, then Murray Forsyth and Maurice Keynes-Soper, A Guide to Political Classics, you should refer to, and you can also refer to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which is edited by J.C.A. Gaskin, Oxford University Press, and also Shefali Jha, Alan Rand, and these two books we have been referring to in all the lectures that we have covered. And also you should refer to Richard Tuck, Leviathan, which is the revised student edition published from Cambridge University Press in 2003. So, these are some of the texts you should refer to understand Hobbesian contribution to political science, his understanding of human nature or description of a state of nature, sovereignty and political obligation. So, that is all in today's lecture. Do share your comments and feedbacks. Thanks for listening. Thank you all.